Good afternoon, everybody. This is the online conference, 13 years since the 2008 Russia-Georgia war. And what we hope to do in the next hour or so is to look at the legacy for European security. It's a privilege for me to moderate this session, and we've got a very distinguished panel, which I'll introduce individually as we come to each speaker. But first of all, I'm privileged to introduce you now to the Georgian ambassador to Ireland, His Excellency George Zurabashvili. George and I know each other for many years. He was previously the Chargé d'Affaires and has been the ambassador now for the last number of years. Ambassador George, Your Excellency, the webinar is yours.
Dear moderator, Admiral Mellett, thank you very much for the introduction. First of all, allow me to express my gratitude to yourself and each panelist for your contribution in today's webinar that is dedicated to 13 years since the last Russian large-scale invasion as the ongoing occupation of Georgia's territories. Also, I would like to thank our attendees, our audience, for your time and interest towards Eastern Europe, the Black Sea region, in particular towards Georgia. The webinar is designed to present the conflict from the different angles, to walk you through the various intersections, starting from showing the facts by the Georgian Minister of Foreign Affairs, recognized by the international community, focusing on the solution and deoccupation, then all the way down to hear the invaluable voice from the occupation line coming out from the EUMM International Observer, further stretching towards legal aspects of the international law and conventions and their implications presented by a world-class international lawyer, concluding by a remarkable diplomatic journalist discussing on Russia's hybrid warfare through a vast range of propaganda, disinformation, cyber attack, and so on. It is obvious that Russia's imperial ideology combined with the military forces pose a threat to its neighborhood. The quotation that Russia is never so strong nor so weak as it appears is arguably true for all its ability to invade and annex neighbors, to subvert democratic institutions, to undermine unity, to destroy economy, and to tear indigenous soil territories from one another. It is an absolute need from the international community to be more active, more vocal, and more decisive by defending the principles to bring Russia to respect the international law and the well-established international order, and to withdraw its illegal military forces from the Georgian soil. I wish to express my gratitude to the Irish government supporting Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity within the internationally recognized borders, and as a member state of the European Union for co-launching EUMM, the non-military observers mission, with 8 Irish serving on the daily basis on the grounds in Georgia, observing the occupation line. Georgia remains firmly committed to the peaceful resolution of the conflict and the de-escalation of tensions with Russia based on respect of Georgia's territorial integrity and sovereignty. The European Union and the world community needs a safe, stable, and peaceful Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. It is therefore critical that Georgia strengthens its role as a proactive contributor to Black Sea security, as Georgia has already proved itself as a reliable EU partner, trustworthy NATO partner, and contributor to European and Euro-Atlantic security through active participation in counterterrorism operations led by the US and NATO, and its active engagement in the EU peacekeeping missions. Just recently, we supported withdrawal of the NATO and the partner forces from Afghanistan, providing the host nation support, ensuring safe landing in Tbilisi airport to over 20 charter flights from Kabul, offering temporary placement for over 2,500 evacuees. Dear moderator, I will stop here to allow our panelists to make their absorbing presentation. Thank you very much, and wishing all productive and interesting discussion. Thank you.
Ambassador George, thank you very much. And I have to say, in my time as a member of the military committee in Europe, I certainly was very impressed with your contribution, your country's contribution, not just to EU military missions, but also to our civilian missions, and we may reference those in a few moments. So I'm going to ask each panelist to speak for about 5 minutes. I may follow on with a question myself, and then I'll go from panelist to panelist. And at the end of that, and I would ask those who are actually attending this webinar, if you have any questions you wish to put in at any stage, just use the Q&A function, and we'll rack and stack those for the end of the webinar, and then we should have an opportunity to discuss those. So going straight to Professor Ketevan Chumbadze, who's acting political director for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia. Katie is a distinguished academic career, a visiting professor at Tbilisi State University. You've worked with UN Women, and you've also worked at as a Carnegie Research Fellow at George Washington University. There are many other points I'd like to raise about you, Katie, but I'll just ask you to move on and perhaps give your presentation. And I think you're looking at the legacy of Russia's 2008 occupation and Georgia's struggle since 2008. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to first very warmly greet all the panelists and also our audience, attendees, and those visitors who are following us in live stream, in Facebook, in other social media. And I would like to thank for this engagement and interest in the subject. With your permission, I would like to touch upon the issue of the legacy of 2008 war between Georgia and Russia and the military aggression that was conducted by the Russian Federation 13 years ago. And sometimes people on the international arena think that that was something that happened so just 13 years ago, and that's all. But unfortunately, this is not the process that ended there. So the legacy of Russia's full-scale military aggression in August 2008 continues further. And even today, we see the consequences of this ongoing, I would say, military aggression. This is the ongoing occupation of 2 Georgian regions, which in total so means 20% of Georgia's territory. But of course, this is not only about the territory. This is about people, about the culture, about population of our country, be it ethnic Abkhaz, ethnic Ossetians, or ethnic Georgians who reside in those regions, and about those people who are suffering under daily provocations, who are suffering under daily ethnic discrimination and ill treatment by the occupation forces. 13 years ago, what happened in Georgia, of course, this was not an isolated case. And this was, from the Russian side, the act that tested the ground, that tested the West, the desire of West, whether the European Union, whether the United States, whether the international institutions were ready to counter such threat and security challenge and such attack to the rules-based international system. And while in 2008, Russia tested the entire international community in Georgia, afterwards, it successfully exercised the same practice in Ukraine in 2014. And Russia saw that it was allowed and it was possible for it to follow, to take such aggressive stance to violate the territorial integrity and to disregard the inviolability of internationally recognized borders of sovereign countries. And afterwards to talk about some new realities, as if all this what it committed in Georgia and Ukraine was fait accompli and something that needs to be accepted by the international community, by Europe, and by the West. And that is why it remains very much critical now to understand the logic of Russia's aim and pattern of Russia's behavior, including the hybrid warfare, what Russia continues now to utilize against Georgia, because this is the most successful instrument now in Russia's hand, because it doesn't need military or armed hostilities right now to be taken against Georgia to achieve its revanchist aims and goals in the wider Black Sea region. And it is very successfully using this hybrid warfare in the wider Black Sea region in order to project power, in order to undermine the values, in order to undermine the rules-based international system, and to demonstrate that Moscow is able to do what it wants in order to achieve the Kremlin's political agenda. And that is why it is of utmost importance, and it is really decisive that the international community and the West duly assess the aims and the tactics and the pattern of the Russian Federation, and adopts the approach and proactive stance in order to counter all these activities. Otherwise, Russia, of course, continues in inertia of the Cold War in order to undermine peace and stability in this region, and to force the entire international community to accept this so-called new reality, where there are no rules, no principles, no international norms accepted. So that is why it is really critical that the international community demonstrates firm stance in this region and engages more in Georgia, in the South Caucasus, and in the entire Eastern Partnership region. And that is why this region needs to be kept very, very high in the political agenda of the European Union, of the Western allies within the NATO, and in the political agenda of all European countries and of the United States. With your permission, I would like to very briefly touch upon Georgia's policy towards peace and security, Georgia's peaceful conflict resolution policy, because it is very strong desire of our government to demonstrate that Georgia is very much interested to become hub for peace, for development in the region. And that is why our government is trying to facilitate ensuring peace and security in Georgia, in the South Caucasus, and in the wider Black Sea region. We are not only consumers in that regard, as Ambassador already mentioned, but also very much trying to contribute in facilitation of peace and security in this region and also beyond. And that is why the government pursues very active peaceful conflict resolution policy, which on the one hand relies on dealing and solving this issue with Russia and countering occupation, and at the same time towards engagement with Abkhaz and Ossetian fellow citizens in the occupied territories. Thank you very much. I would stop here and, of course, would be delighted to answer your questions.
That was excellent, and thank you very much, Katie. Just, I suppose, what real impact can the international institutions make to greater progress in terms of the occupied territories in Georgia?
Thank you for this question. Actually, Georgia is really lucky to have quite broad engagement of international institutions, because in the peaceful, in peace talks we have with the Russian Federation, these peace negotiations are moderated and facilitated by all key international organizations, which are the European Union, the United Nations, and the OSCE. And we see that all those organizations are very actively engaged in the process to build peace and to facilitate peaceful resolution of the conflict. And at the same time, they are supporting and funding also a lot of confidence building measures. At the same time, it seems to me that there still is a space and there still is the possibility to be more effectively engaged with more proactive steps and with more result-oriented approach in this process. And okay. I truly think that the European Union has the competence, the capacity, the mandate to be more engaged in the peace process here in Georgia.
Thank you very much. And we may pick up on that point as we go in through the other panelists. I'm going to introduce Kate Fearon now. And Kate, you're Deputy Head of the European Union Monitoring Mission in Georgia, and you're former participant in the Northern Ireland peace talks. You've had a distinguished career in Brussels and in the Balkans. You're an academic. You've written a number of books, I think in the case of Northern Ireland and also on Afghanistan. And I know you're going to look at the security dimension and the human rights implications of the violation of the EU-mediated plan of 2008. So I'll hand the floor over to you, Catherine, and it's all yours now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Zurabashvili, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be able to join you today and to speak to the theme of security and human rights implications of the violation of the EU-mediated six-point agreement, and to speak to why implementation matters. Since many of you may not be familiar with the work of the European Union Monitoring Mission EUMM in Georgia, I will firstly say a little bit about the origin and mandate of the mission, before turning to how that mandate is operationalized in practice and the relevance for our theme today. So EUMM is a civilian unarmed mission, one of 11 such EU Common Security and Defence Policy missions, CSDP missions globally. We are unique amongst the mission in being a monitoring mission with a broad mandate to contribute to long-term stability throughout Georgia and its surrounding region, and in the shorter term to contribute to stabilization through reducing the risk of a return to hostilities. Our operations are arranged around 4 pillars: stabilization, normalization, confidence building, and informing EU policy. So stabilization means the duty to monitor, analyze, and report on the situation centered around full compliance with the six-point agreement, which includes reporting on things like troop withdrawals, military dynamic, freedom of movement, as well as any human rights violations or international humanitarian law violations. Normalization means the duty to report on normalization process of, for example, civil governance situation with regard to internally displaced persons, for example. And under these 2 pillars, we also report on conflict drivers, such as the activities of security actors, military dynamics, any so-called borderization activities. And in particular, we are interested in reporting and analyzing the effects of these activities on the conflict-affected population, be they ethnic Georgian, ethnic Abkhaz, ethnic Ossetian, and living on both sides of the administrative boundary line, the ABL, as we say. And these things we very much view through a gendered lens. For example, on things like access to healthcare, it's important for us to understand the impact of someone not being able to move, no freedom of movement, restrictions of freedom of movement on women's reproductive health, for example, and access to reproductive health care is an issue in regard to both South Ossetia and Abkhazia, though for slightly different reasons. Confidence building means that we contribute to the reduction of tensions through liaison and facilitation of contact between the various actors. And the 4 principal instruments that we use for this are: we have a mission operated hotline, which enables direct contact through between the various actors. Messages can be transmitted at any time through day or night, for example, on detentions or on other pressing issues. We have the Incident Prevention and Response Mechanism, the IPRM. We, together with our OSCE partners, are responsible for co-facilitating the IPRM for the Argneti Theatre, and that's where all participants can get around the same table and discuss technical and very practical matters on a roughly 6-week basis. We also have a small fund, a small confidence building facility that we use to dispense a small amount of money that promotes people-to-people contact across the ABLs. And then we also support, though we're not participants per se, we're not members per se, but we support the co-chairs of the Geneva International Discussion, so the UN, the EUSR, the OSCE. We support them with our information and analysis, briefing them whenever they come to theatre, and indeed before each round of the Geneva talks. The fourth pillar is around informing EU policy, and that's where we're feeding in our findings on the ground to member states in Brussels. And regrettably, while our mandate does cover the whole of Georgia, we're not able to physically access the breakaway regions of South Ossetia or Abkhazia. So it's all the more important to us that we maintain and develop strong relationships with the conflict-affected population on both sides of the ABL. And we operate on a strict principle of operational impartiality. That is, we report our findings as we see them. And maybe just to contextualize the physical environment for an Irish audience, let me maybe sketch out some comparisons. So for a start, Georgia and Ireland are remarkably similar in terms of size. They're both about 70,000 square kilometers with about 5 million people each. Both have a long experience of, let's say, external governance, and both formally declared independence, let's say, originally in the early 1920s. Georgia, of course, though, has much better weather and much better wine than Ireland, so that's a clear advantage for Georgia there. But when we speak of the breakaway regions, size-wise, though not population-wise, if you think about South Ossetia, it is slightly bigger than County Antrim, and it's got around 30,000 people. Abkhazia is a little bigger than County Cork, or as I know how some people like to say, the People's Republic of Cork, if you're from Cork, but with many fewer people, only about 240,000 people. So if you imagine that Antrim and Cork were inaccessible to the majority of people on the island, that if somebody lived there, you would need a special permit to go, let's say, between Cork and Limerick to buy your groceries, or from Ballymena to Belfast, for example. This is exactly what the citizens of the Gali district in Abkhazia have to do in order to buy goods in the nearest market town of Zugdidi, which is on Tbilisi administered territory. So the situation arises very much due to the fact that the Russian Federation isn't in compliance with the 2008 agreement. We go out visibly around the ABL every day. We know from speaking to the conflict-affected population that our presence lends them a sense of security, a sense of reassurance. And we know that our role as facilitators in the Argneti IPRM also results in positive outcomes on technical matters like agreement on irrigation water, drinking water, or electricity supply across the ABL where the infrastructure goes across. In terms of some human security examples, maybe one or two talking about how the impact on people and conflict-affected population. So in terms of, for example, crossing from Abkhazia into Tbilisi administered territory, we estimate around 2,000 crossings every day back and forth. Before the pandemic, it was roughly 2,500, maybe sometimes 3,000 a day. But for a period of 15 months, this crossing point was completely closed. So Gali residents were unable to cross into TAT to see relatives, to do shopping, etc. The situation with respect to South Ossetia is significantly worse. So since September 2019, the main crossing point, in fact, all of the crossing points there have been closed. And in every weekday, there would have been around 400 crossings. So if we kind of think of all of the crossings that haven't happened, it'll be around 200,000 crossings in the over 2 years of closure. So that means really that 200,000 interactions, intercommunal, interfamilial, between different relatives. Those connections have been lost. And what happens when such communities are cut off from each other like this is that basic human needs are compromised. There are fewer income sources, there's less access to medicine, there's a lack of mother tongue education, but there is also a strategic and structural social isolation of individuals, of families, and of entire communities who live either side of the ABL. So kinship connections are lost over time, but so too are bicommunal connections. And experiencing the other is diminished and diminishing. And just from my personal perspective, I grew up in a monocultural, monoreligious environment with one political perspective and no experience of the other. And I know that that is just no way to resolve conflicts or to recognize past hurts, mutually caused at various times, yet alone try to reconcile the past. I have one more point, if I may, Mark, and it's just to say that we are speaking to people who are anxious about crossing the ABL, that they, for example, we speak to a woman regularly who's too nervous to visit her daughter, whose kids were unable to go to school in TAT, on Tbilisi administered territory. She cannot get her social welfare benefits because of the situation with the crossing points. So non-compliance of the agreement keeps everybody, central government of Georgia, de facto authorities of the breakaway regions, and everybody who lives throughout Georgia from in a kind of political and social limbo, while there's so much more potentially to be gained by full compliance. So EUMM, from its perspective, will continue to monitor, analyze the situation, and we look forward to the day when the political actors will reach a settlement on these very complex matters. Thank you.
Okay, Kate, thanks very much for a very comprehensive vignette there. And I'm glad and I know you've been involved with UN Women, and I'm glad you touched on the issue of the gender dimension in terms of conflict. And I suppose one of the remarkable statistics I recently looked at is the robustness and success where you have women facilitators and mediators in terms of the peace process. And I just want to commend your own engagement in this process up to now. But just briefly to touch on, and maybe there are obvious differences between Northern Ireland and Georgia, but could you just bring some insights on any practices you saw in terms of Northern Ireland that may have utility in this case?
Well, maybe just to again reflect on my own experience. So speaking more in a personal capacity, I mean, one thing that I think was key to breaking the deadlock in Northern Ireland was basically making the pie bigger before dividing it up between everybody. So adding into constitutional, political and legal questions, the kind of a basket of rights, looking at things like dealing with the past, acknowledging the rights of victims, acknowledging the rights of those traditionally outside of or traditionally excluded from political processes. And I think, of course, we can say how well that's been implemented, but I think in terms of making a breakthrough, really engaging with the other, trying to reach mutual understanding, and thinking about those things not in an abstract way, but trying to really give practice to it. So I think acknowledgement about the past initially, and then kind of shifting forward to really transform the society. I think you need to acknowledge what has gone before. As I say, you can argue in Northern Ireland we have not been maybe as successful as we might have been, but in terms of having something in the agreement that everybody could see themselves part of, I think there might be some room for room for inspiration, let's say, for the Georgian context.
Thank you very much, and just to commend you again for your leadership. I'll move on to our next speaker now, Professor Jean-Marc Touvanin from the University of Paris-Nanterre. You've also, Jean-Marc, are the Secretary General of the Hague Academy on International Law, and you're former director and a member of the Ceasefire Centre for International Law. I know you're going to focus on unresolved conflicts in Europe's eastern neighbourhoods, Georgia and Ukraine, and the human rights and legal dimensions of that for facilitating peace. And maybe you might touch on the ECHR judgment in the case of Georgia and Russia. If not, I might bring a question in at the end. So Jean-Marc, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, indeed, I'm speaking today on my own personal capacity, of course. I just want to disclose that I'm a counsel and advocate for Ukraine in a series of cases between Ukraine and Russia. So this is said. Coming to the subject, what is considered unresolved conflict here concerns Georgia, of course, but also Ukraine and also Armenia and Azerbaijan. And you know that there is some news about this conflict, but also Moldova and its problems with Transnistria. And some say that Kazakhstan could well be the next. One of the common features of all these cases is obviously Russia. There, Russia creates, maintains, or tries to create what has been theorized as a controllable instability, aiming at preparing Russia's takeover upon parts of those territories. One element of this method is very classical now. It's namely the passporization, which is the awarding of Russian passport and citizenship of the Russian Federation to the residents of the targeted territories. And as we know, this is what Russia did in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, as well as more recently in East Ukraine. Mr. Chairman, there is a question in the Q&R from Gano Harity, which is focusing on that. If you allow me 1 minute more, I can answer right away to this question, and thank you to Gano Harity. He asked what is the status of these Georgians persons having a Russian passport due to passporization? Well, my answer is to say that I'm in Paris and I have a partner next door in my law firm. He has also a United States passport. He's a national of the United States, but it doesn't change anything in the fact that he has to respect French laws and French authority when he is in the French soil. He cannot claim, of course, that his office just next door to mine is under the US jurisdiction. That would be ridiculous. So it changes nothing, save that my friend next door has to pay some taxes to the United States. Well, that's his choice. And he can also vote for the presidential election in the United States. So I close this parenthesis, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to answer this question right away. So one of the activities of Russia's army is allegedly peacekeeping. We can hear that in all these stories. They just do peacekeeping, but as aptly said by someone, I think it's someone from Georgia, Russia rather endeavors to keep in pieces, which is a little bit different, as you can imagine. In fact, after the armed hostilities carried out by its army, after the hostilities have ceased, Russia usually manages to preclude the sovereign states upon which territory the hostilities occurred to recover control of this territory. And in the case of Georgia, the key legal move in this regard has been the recognition by Russia that Abkhazia and South Ossetia are sovereign states. So Russia did not go yet so far as to officially recognize, annex those territories, but one can safely speak about a creeping or quasi-annexation. And there is a very recent joint statement of a group of friends of Georgia, 16 countries, delivered last August, which denounced what they called de facto annexation and condemn Russia's policy vis-à-vis Georgia. So 2 questions, if I may, can be put there. One, is it acceptable? Is it somehow acceptable? Should we accept this situation as, it's a fact and let's deal with that? And second, what can be done? I turn to the first point. In the same way as it did more recently concerning Crimea, Vladimir Putin, at the time he was prime minister, he said in 2009, in relation to Abkhazia and South Ossetia, I quote, "It goes without saying that there will be no return to the past situation," end quote. But at least 2 core legal principles command a straightforward rejection of such position. The first one is the core principle upon which the international community as a whole has been built since the end of the Second World War, and that was already strongly emerging before, namely the prohibition of the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any states. And you know, these are the words of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, namely an article which elaborates on what is called a rule of jus cogens. So the rules of jus cogens are the more important in the international legal orders, those that must, those which are inherent to the very existence of the international community. And for this reason, the situation is not acceptable because it is the outcome of the use of force and now of the threat of use of force by the Russian Federation, which keeps its army ready to combat Georgia should Georgia try to recover its sovereignty or its jurisdiction over these territories. So that's one point. The second core principle is in respect of international obligations deriving from treaties or commitments. And you recall, and it has been mentioned just a second ago, that on the 12th of August 2008, Russia accepted the Sixth Principle Ceasefire Agreement. It was on the 12th of August 2008, and it was accepted. It was not signed, it was accepted orally, but it has the same force in terms of international commitment. Now, some days after, less than 1 month after, Russia killed this agreement by recognizing the sovereignty of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And that cannot be a good faith implementation of an international agreement. It doesn't work like that. It's a clear violation of the word of the sovereign states, and that cannot be acceptable. So I think that these are the main reasons why Georgia has so many friends when it stands against Russia's fait accompli. Now, I believe that this is, of course, now it's almost an old story. You know, it is a story dating back from 2008. So, but what is very striking is that the stance in favor of Georgia is more and more strong. Very recently, in August 2021, as I said, a group of UN Security Council members, that's not nothing, adopted it was in August, adopted a joint statement denouncing Russia's clear violation of international law and denouncing its violation of the Sixth Principle Agreement of August 2012. Now, the funny thing is that, of course, Russia says, well, it was not an agreement. We did not sign anything. It's a myth. And so this is a recent statement of Russia, which is always trying to downplay, of course, what is not in its favor. But the world knows that it is a commitment and that it should be respected. I finish, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm a little bit long. I'm sorry for that. I just finish with one word to say what can be done, and then we can perhaps proceed further. But well, what can be done is first refuse, protest, huge pressure, document what goes on the ground, and use courts and tribunal when possible. They can be turning points because of courts and tribunals. And I do think that the recent decision of January 2021 by the European Court of Human Rights is a legal turning point.
Excellent, Professor. Thank you very much. And tour de force, just I suppose, going back to the point, are the international institutions doing enough? Can the international law and the institutions even facilitate further action in the context of the, I suppose, breaches of the agreement and the requirement for the institutions of sovereignty and sovereign rights to be fully upheld?
Well, nowadays, of course, and I think this is something I will support, only means to using peaceful means of dispute settlement are to be used. So the means of peaceful settlement are mentioned in Article 33 of the UN Charter, and we all know that it's about negotiation, conciliation, mediation, and also judicial dispute settlement. So we have to focus on that. There is a further method nowadays, we all know, it's about sanctions. And so you know that I didn't see a lot of sanctions with respect to the Georgian situation, but with respect to Ukraine, the European Union, the United States, and some others, Australia, Canada, did adopt sanctions in order to try to pressure Russia to respect international law. So this is perhaps a further avenue. It's very complicated, of course, because as we know, the European Union has different interests, and it's difficult to have a unanimous approach of the European Union when it comes to sanctions, but that's a possibility. Now, what I do think is that what is easier to a certain extent is to go to courts and tribunal. And I said that the European Court of Human Rights is delivered a turning point judgment. And the important point I wanted to stress is that the European Court based its decision on the facts found on the ground by all the institutions you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, including the EUMM, we heard about a second ago, including the OSCE, the European Union, of course, etc. So it's an integrated approach, I would say, basing a finding of facts on the work of those who go on the ground and take risk, and they are heroes in this regard. And the court then can build a sound reasoning and decision on this base. Now, what did the court decide? And why is it a turning point? Very shortly, it decided that it's not a decision. It considered that on the basis of facts, as completely discussed by the parties, that Russia exercised effective control on these two provinces. Effective control, and that means that they cannot be sovereign states. So all the legal construction of Russia to try to escape its obligations based on the recognition of these two provinces as states, all this construction is down. It's a fake legal argument. We know it because we have an authoritative judgment, 16 judges against one, voting in favor of saying, which is obvious, Russia has effective control. That's a turning point on which to build.
Sir, thank you very much. And we may come back to the issue of sanctions in our further discussion. Now, the Q&A is open and we would welcome some questions. I see a number of questions in there already. I would just say to Ketty, you might look at those because they relate to the status in terms of Gali. They also relate to the role of the IPRM and also to the status of the citizens that are actually in South Ossetia and the occupied territory area. I'm going to move on to Micheál O'Hurley. He's the editor of Diplomacy Ireland. That's the European Diplomat. He's also a lawyer, an academic, and author of several books, and a US military veteran. So we have much in common. Micheál, just looking at your CV, you're clearly an entrepreneur also. So credit to you. And you're going to look at the disinformation and propaganda machinery, the hybrid warfare being used against Georgia and European security, and examine the whole issue of this threat in terms of its, I suppose, perversity in the context of rule-based international good order. So Micheál, the floor is yours.
Mark, thank you very much. Ambassador Zurabashvili, thank you for inviting me to the panel. And to my fellow panelists, I'm astounded by what you've said today, the wisdom of it. And I hope it helps illuminate people to the issues that continue to go on in Georgia. And I say continue because so many years after the Soviet invasion and occupation began, we have a generation of diplomats who weren't in diplomatic service when it happened. This is ancient history for them. But for the Georgian people, for the people in the Caucasus to continue to endure occupation, this is a daily reality. And we can't let the world's many fraying ropes distract us from the fact that it continues in Georgia. And it's often as an older conflict started by Russia, it's escaped our present memory, and we kind of need to be reminded. Let me start, Mr. Moderator, by saying that I speak for myself and my publication as a journalist. I've been covering wars since 1991 in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, Iran, South America. I've been all over the globe studying conflict. And I've worked as a mediator from the United States Institute for Peace. One of the things that I think we need to resolve right now is an issue that Jean-Marc illuminated very clearly, and that's the double standard of Russia saying one thing and doing another. When I was in law school, I didn't talk about effective control very much. It's a legal theory and it's a very important one. But my professors pounded the issue home by saying, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck. Russia cannot continue to claim that these are breakaway republics when it essentially approves, if not appoints, who governs them, how they're governed. It provides the money and is intricately involved in everyday decisions within those republics. In fact, I take issue with the idea of calling them breakaway republics because they are sovereign Georgian territory. And this leads into the issue of hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is all about confusion. Hybrid warfare has three essential components. The first one is conventional warfare, boots on the ground, rifles in the hands, jet fighters overhead, and bombers unleashing munitions on military and civilian targets. Anybody who knows what happened in Georgia knows that Georgia and civilian populations were subjected to this illegal kind of warfare, this conventional warfare. So let's set that aside because we can all think about conventional warfare very easily. We need to talk about cyber warfare. We hear a lot about it, but it's much more sophisticated than we think. Whether it's running a criminal enterprise out of St. Petersburg, hacking into the SolarWinds software to gain access to computers around the world, or whether it's creating profiles on social media and causing confusion with different messaging that only serves the purpose of confusing the general population. Cyber warfare affects us all here in Ireland, in South America, in Australia, in Japan, and certainly in Georgia. So one of the things I want to say is that the ABL, the contact line in Georgia, isn't just physical. It's psychological and emotional. Cutting people off from the education of their mother tongue challenges their identity. Going back to Jean-Marc's point, passportization tells people that you're not Georgian, you're Russian. It helps to change their identity. It's a slow erosion. Many people don't even notice it until it's far too late that they aren't the person they once thought they were. Their entire identity has changed. Often it's generational. Young people who didn't learn Georgian because it's prohibited are now separated from their parents for who it was their mother tongue and their identity and their culture. So it's hybrid warfare can reach into every part of our lives. And then I want to talk about irregular warfare. Irregular warfare is basically anything the government does that isn't effectively under their control, but serves their goal. By supporting these militias in Georgia, and they are militias, they are meant to destabilize Georgia. They get their orders from Moscow. They're commanded by specialists and advisors from Russia. They are furthering the occupation's stranglehold on Georgia. And it's happening all over the world, whether it's in Syria or South America or in the Congo. We hear about Wagner, these special mercenaries. This is all part of hybrid warfare. So hybrid warfare targets three distinct communities: conventional battlefields, indigenous populations, and the international community. I want to talk about the indigenous populations, the people of Georgia. By stringing a barbed wire fence across someone's farm, they no longer have a means to their livelihood. By making them get a special pass to get a quart of milk or a pint of milk, we've changed their very lives. The Georgian people are being subjected to separation and destabilization at every point. And when I talk about the indigenous people, I want to talk about Georgia as a people, as a nation. And it is an ancient nation, which is separate from the state. One of the problems we have today is that Russian cyber warriors are continually sending out a message that the Russian government is the friend of the people. They are peacekeepers, when, as Jean-Marc says, that's highly dubious, if not outrageously ridiculous. They aren't peacekeepers. They weren't in Abkhazia, Ossetia. They weren't in Nagorno-Karabakh. They are there to have boots on the ground to reinforce a political agenda, which is to destabilize nations. What I want to get clear, though, is that when I read in the news how corrupt the Georgian government is, when I read in the news that Georgia needs to reform its judiciary, Georgia needs to do this, Georgia needs to do that, almost always these are caricatures from the past. Anybody that looks at the modern legislation in Georgia sees that Georgia has made leaps and bounds towards having one of the more evolved legal codes in Europe. In Europe, the work on the judiciary is envied by several countries, and that's the same with Ukraine. I also want to talk about resources. Kate, you talked about the infrastructure crossing the ABL. Think about Moldova right now. Russia has decided to turn off gas in what weather forecasters say will be one of the longest and coldest winters in 50 years. That is a way of reinforcing the idea that Russia has control. And it happens in Moldova, it happens in Georgia. I want to wrap up by a couple ideas here. And the last one I want to leave you with is we need to talk about causality. We often talk about, the degradation of institutions. We talk about the effects on daily life, but we aren't talking about the cancer that is at the root of this. We need to effectively work like a surgeon and like a doctor and go to the heart of stopping Russia's spread of its influence throughout all of Europe and to its neighbors, if not the world. We are too over-focused on the treatment of symptoms and not causality. And as a rules-based world order, I agree with Jean-Marc that we need to use the courts, use them effectively, and we need to hold Russia accountable to its words if it's possible. And my last comment is, there was a young Jewish lawyer, he was an American soldier in World War II. His name was Ben Ferentz. Ben was an old friend of mine, a mentor. He pushed the limits of the law to engineer the idea of crimes against humanity. We need to take a look at the law, not as what we've done in the past, but what can be done to use the law to serve its intended purpose, which is to protect people and peace and sovereign states to live without the fear of invasion and interference. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, Michal, thank you very much. Another tour de force. And do you think that hybrid warfare is now institutionalized throughout the democratic world and is being weaponized by certain states?
Oh, not only is it being weaponized, I think there are practitioners who don't realize they're part of the problem. The Panama Papers were recently in the news about corruption. And instead of naming Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs, they named people of states where Russia had attacked and that were truly victims. I'm not defending the people in the Panama Papers. What I am saying, though, is we perpetuate stereotypes and tropes and dog whistles as reporters, because reporters are no longer educated people in a specific discipline, who go out and meet and talk to people, they rip news off the teletype and rewrite the story from a news bureau. So people aren't getting the comprehensive view of issues that they need. And that's why Georgia has slipped down the list of our attention. And that's why on issues of freedom of navigation, to human rights issues, to basic human needs, we aren't serving Georgia, and our institutions aren't being clamored to do a better job simply because the public doesn't know enough about the issues, because we're into a soundbite age who rely on a teletype to give us the news as opposed to research, presentation, and journalism.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I know we've gone a little bit over time, and I was keen to get to some questions. I did flag some there with Ketty. You might just switch on your mic there, Ketty. There was a number of questions relating to the Gali situation. What is the situation in the Gali region? You might be able to address that. And also the legal status of the citizens in South Ossetia and so on. Maybe just briefly to comment on that. And if any other panelists wish to come in, please do so. I'm conscious about time, but Ketty, to you.
Thank you very much. I will try to be very brief and very targeted. So thank you, Craig, for your question regarding the situation with the people in the Gali district. Of course, this, for those who don't know, this is the district which is populated by ethnic Georgians and is currently under Russian control in the occupied Abkhazia region. And of course, these people are, so to say, turned and treated as so-called foreigners. And that is why these people are very, very much under pressure, and these people suffer and are facing daily discriminatory treatment and daily restrictions. So unfortunately, despite our efforts somehow to address this issue from the humanitarian perspective and a lot of demands in the peace talks, these people continue to be discriminated on the basis of their ethnicity. In the schools, ethnic Georgian people, pupils are not allowed to study in their mother tongue, and this is also psychological pressure under them. And also these people are pressured and forced to take so-called residence permits, which is actually designed for so-called gastarbeiters from Central Asia or from different regions that are illegally residing in those regions. And this is humiliating for ethnic Georgians living there, because these people who are living there for generations, who are local residents there, are now forced to register as foreigners. And also, this document means that they will be deprived of exercising their basic rights, like property right, like right to freedom of movement, like a right to participate in political or social life. And that is why these people continue to be hostages of Russia's effective control there and Russia's occupation. And I think that I will also touch upon the issue which was raised by another participant regarding the citizenship, or about Georgia's attitude towards people inside those regions. And yes, there are people, regardless their ethnicity, be it Georgians, be it Abkhaz, be it, I don't know, Ukrainians. There are also Estonians, ethnic Estonians residing in Abkhazia region. And all of them, regardless the legal passports they have from Russia, they are considered by Georgian state as our fellow citizens. Because they are part of our population and because we have our positive obligations towards them. And here I only mean those people who are legally residing in those regions, because there are also people who illegally reside in this region. And these are people who entered the occupied territories after the war, after occupation, and those who captured houses that were left by Georgian IDPs. And of course, we can't consider these kind of illegal immigrants as our population, but those people who are legally residing and living there for generations, although they have been forced by Russia to take illegal Russian passports or other travel documents, they are part of Georgian population and they are part of our culture and they are treated as part of Georgian population. And that is why the Georgian government provides all the goods, all the benefits that are considered for Georgian citizens, regardless they possess Georgian passports or not. They are part of our population, and this was made very clear also by Strasbourg Court. Jean-Marc mentioned this historical judgment, and I think that this judgment, this ruling was very clear about Russia's responsibility as occupying power, and at the same time about the positive obligation Georgia has as mother state towards its sovereign lands and towards the people who are living legally in those regions. With your permission, I would be very, very quick also about the current state of affairs, because I think it's also very much important to be very precise, and that right now it's not only the status quo of occupation, but Russia is day by day, week by week, absorbing those regions and integrating into Russia's political, military, social, economic systems. And there are a lot of different so-called agreements to finalize de facto annexation process. And it's also very much critical to make very clear for the Western audience that this is not only about Georgia. The aims and the political agenda of Russia and the purpose what Russia is doing in Abkhazia or the Tskhinvali region, this is not the aims it has vis-a-vis Georgia only. This is part of Russia's political agenda vis-a-vis the West. And this is part of the Western security and the security of the European Union and European Union as a peace project and the international community. And that is why I think that in 2008, all of us in the West lacked the understanding that this is something related to the European security and not on the distance somewhere in other regions or frontiers. So this is really very core issue of the European security, and there should be the understanding in the West that implementation of the ceasefire agreement, this is the obligation that was taken by then Russian president vis-a-vis the EU presidency. This is the obligation towards the European Union. And that is why the implementation of the ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian forces from the occupied territories, and deployment of international security mechanisms inside those regions, this is something that should be kept very high in European Union's agenda, alongside with the implementation of the Minsk agreements over Ukraine. So there cannot be any separation between the ceasefire agreement or Minsk agreements, because both of them are about European security.
I'm just conscious that we're against the backstop in terms of time, and thanks for dealing with those questions. I want to just give one final opportunity to the other panelists, and I'll just go through the panelists. I'll come first of all to Kate. Catherine, do you want to make any closing remarks before we close off?
Thanks, Mark. I would just really endorse what Michal said in terms of really the most insidious border, so to speak, being the border in people's minds, where people are afraid to cross the ABL to go to funerals, where people are afraid to tend to their agricultural land for fear of being detained, and this kind of self-censorship and the self-restrictions that are put. And that's something that we certainly see in our actions with the conflict-affected population.
Thank you very much, Kate. Jean-Marc, do you want to make any closing remarks?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. There is a question about the peacekeeping operation of the Russian army in Nagorno-Karabakh. And the question is whether it represents how conflict in the region will be managed in the future. I think that the important point to keep in mind is that in principle, peacekeeping operations are under the responsibility of the UN Security Council. So that should be the main manner to deal with peacekeeping operations. And there is a track record on how to do it. There is a history, there is an experience, and they know how to do it. And generally, they don't use arms. So they don't go on the theater of operation with tanks and rockets, etc. So that's the first point. The second point is, well, look at Article 52 of the UN Charter. And the Article 52 of the UN Charter says that the Charter authorizes regional arrangements or agencies for dealing with peacekeeping operations. So to the extent that a peacekeeping operation anywhere is carried out in respect of the UN Charter, to my view, it's fine. Then on the ground, we should expect them to respect, the rule of law, the human rights, etc. That's another problem.
Thank you. Jean-Marc, I'll just go on to Michal. Have you any final closing remarks, Michal, you'd like to make?
Quite quickly, I just want to say that people are entitled to their opinions, but not their own facts. And this is an important point, because when I speak to people in the European Commission and the European Parliament, people in Dáil Éireann here in the Irish Parliament, and when I speak to academics especially, the idea that we have academics visiting occupied territories, identifying with the ideas of the occupying forces, and then teaching it under the guise of academic freedom. We need to be very wary of this. The facts must be the facts. Facts and truth are immutable. These are ancient ideas, and we can't allow hybrid warfare to become effective and weaponized in our institutions of power, which are responsible for these issues, and by the academy, which forms young minds.
Okay, Michal, thanks very much. Well said. And Katie, just to come back to you before I go back to George, anything else you want to add before we close?
Thank you very much. I think almost all questions were answered. There was also a question about the possibility to somehow share the best practice of IPRMs in other conflict cases. And of course, we would be very happy to share this experience. Actually, when we talk about the peace architecture or experiences in conflict contexts throughout the Eastern Partnership region, of course, there are a lot of things in common, despite a lot of differences, of course. And that is why I think that these experiences and sharing of these experiences is very, very interesting and important, because in the end, pattern of Russia in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova, in other conflict cases, all these are the same, because in the end, Russia's ambition is somehow to project power throughout the wider Black Sea region, to undermine the credibility of the West, of Western values, of the European Union as peace project. And that is why all these needs very consolidated strategic approach from the West. And this challenge Russia is posing towards peace and stability in Europe cannot be addressed in isolated manner. And that is why unity throughout the European Union, among the member states, also I would say throughout transatlantic family, this is very, very important. And the most critical thing is also to have a strategic look at this region, the strategic vision, how to address challenge coming from Russia. This is what we are missing and lacking right now, unfortunately. And that is why I think that the solution of this problem lies here, finding strategic vision, strategic way out from this situation. And that is why this kind of strategic brainstormings about among the European capitals is really critical, because otherwise we will lose not only the peace and security in Eastern Partnership region, but I truly think that it will be about European security per se, and about Europe tomorrow.
Thank you, Katie. That's I'm going to go back to Ambassador George just to close, but I suppose this has been a very enlightening, I think, session, and I would like to thank all the panelists. I would thank those who participated, and I would also like to thank those who asked questions. I have a very simple philosophy, and I go back in history, and I think of 250,000 years ago when Homo sapiens first appeared in the world, and over those 250,000 years we've evolved with norms and principles that have defined the civilized society that underpins our institutions today. And the right to live in a civilized society, the human right of every man, woman and child, is where people are free, where the institutions of state and the global community function, and where the vulnerable are protected. And where people are not free and where the vulnerable are not protected, I suppose the global community and the civilized community have a duty to act. George, I'll hand it back to you to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm just want to thank you all for this very interesting discussion, and I find it very much informative. I hope it was very much informative for the audience and for those who has attended this meeting, because it brought a lot of clarity to the situation that is happening in Georgia and in the whole entire region as well. So we tried to bring this the ongoing conflict in Georgia from the different angle, from the different crossroads, and I hope that it was quite successful. And thank you very much. We're open for any additional questions that might have that anybody might have. Our websites and our emails are on, so we would love to respond to any questions or queries that might come up in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Okay, just thank you to all our participants, and we're going to close down now to our external participants, if that's possible. And can we just do that now? Thank you.
Please join Diplomacy in Ireland, the European Diplomat, as we present our next event. National readiness in confronting emerging threats and continuing hybrid warfare in Ireland, the EU and throughout the world. We will announce the panellists and date shortly.